It is 4 in the morning on the 24th of February, 1807. The House of Commons is still lit. Candles have been burning for hours. Outside, London is dark and cold, the Thames carrying its slow freight southward toward the sea. Inside this room, men who have been awake since the previous afternoon sit in their benches, coats creased, voices worn down. A vote is about to be taken. The man who set this evening in motion is seated somewhere in the chamber. He is 47 years old. He is small, barely 5 feet 3 inches tall, and his health has been poor for most of his adult life. He has been fighting this particular battle for nearly 20 years. He has lost it many times. He has watched colleagues who shared his views fall away through death, through changed circumstance, through simple fatigue. He has introduced versions of this same argument so often that his opponents have grown almost bored by their own resistance. His name is William Wilberforce. When the votes are counted, the result reads 283 in favor, 16 opposed. The bill for the abolition of the slave trade has passed. By most accounts, Wilberforce wept. Not from triumph, exactly. The word that suggests itself most strongly is relief. The kind that comes not from a sudden victory, but from the slow release of a pressure that has been building for a very long time. He would live for another 26 years. He would not stop working. But to understand why this moment mattered, and why it was so improbable, we need to go back, not to the chamber, to the harbor town where he was born. William Wilberforce was born on the 24th of August, 1759 in Hull. The full name was Kingston upon Hull, and the city wore that designation with a certain justified pride. It was the 4th largest port in England, sitting at the confluence of the rivers Hull and Humber in the East Riding of Yorkshire, and in the middle of the 18th century, it was doing very well indeed. The Wilberforce family had helped make it so. His grandfather, also named William, had built a shipping business of considerable reach, dispatching vessels across the North Sea to Russia, Sweden, and Prussia, returning with lumber, mineral ores, and hemp, materials that fed the expanding appetite of British manufacturing. The business was successful enough to fund a mansion near the River Hull and to eventually carry the elder William Wilberforce into the city's governance. He served as alderman and was elected mayor of Hull in 1745. The family's prosperity was inseparable from the broader prosperity of the British Empire, and that prosperity in the mid-18th century rested on several interlocking systems: trade, finance, manufacturing, and the labor of enslaved people on sugar and tobacco plantations in the Caribbean. The connections between a Baltic timber merchant in Hull and a plantation in Barbados were not always visible, but they were real. The revenues flowing from the West Indies shaped the financial institutions, the political habits, and the social assumptions of everyone in the Wilberforce family's world. This was the air William Wilberforce breathed from birth. Not the air of the plantation, he would never see one, but the air of a prosperous commercial city whose wealth was entangled at several removes with the institution he would later devote his life to destroying. His father Robert had become a managing partner in the family business in 1755, the year he also married Elizabeth Bird, a London woman whose family was itself engaged in trade. They settled in Hull and had 4 children together. Of those 4, only 2 survived infancy. A daughter, Sarah, and a son, William. Robert Wilberforce died in 1768. William was 8 years old. The loss of his father initiated the first significant disruption in what had been a comfortable and unremarkable early childhood. His mother, finding herself in a household weighted by grief and uncertain about her son's upbringing, made a decision that would have lasting consequences. She sent William to live with his aunt and uncle, Hannah and William Wilberforce, at their estate in Wimbledon, Surrey. The move was intended as practical. What it produced was something else entirely. The Wimbledon household was genteel, well-connected, and quietly evangelical. William's aunt and uncle had taken a strong interest in the emerging religious movement associated with John Wesley, what would eventually be called Methodism, and they moved in circles that included some of the more earnest Protestant voices of the era. For a child who had just lost his father and been separated from his mother, this environment offered warmth and structure. It also offered something more specific: a man named John Newton. Newton had lived by that point one of the more extraordinary lives in England. He had gone to sea as a young man, descended into the Atlantic slave trade, suffered a near-fatal storm that he described as the beginning of his spiritual awakening. He had eventually abandoned the trade altogether to become a minister. He was serving as a rector in Olney, Buckinghamshire, and frequently preached in London. He was eloquent, self-aware, and capable of speaking with the authority of genuine experience about the nature of sin and the possibility of redemption. Young William listened to him carefully. He also listened to the broader atmosphere of the Wimbledon household, its conversation, its priorities, its tone. He absorbed something in those years that he would later describe as the beginning of genuine religious feeling. It was not yet anything he could articulate clearly, but it was there. His mother noticed. Elizabeth Wilberforce was a woman of conventional Anglican sensibility. She was religious in the way that most prosperous English women of her generation were religious, faithfully without enthusiasm, within the established bounds of the Church of England. What she heard in her son's letters and conversation during this period alarmed her. The boy was beginning to sound like a Methodist. To a woman of her class and time, this was not a mild concern. Methodism was associated with emotional excess, social disruption, and a certain lowering of oneself that the respectable classes found distasteful. She acted quickly. William was brought back to Hull. He was enrolled at Pocklington School, some 24 miles to the north, where the curriculum was classical and the atmosphere was reassuringly conventional. It worked, at least in the short term. William threw himself into the social life available to the son of a wealthy Hull family. He attended the theater. He cultivated a reputation as a good singer and a lively conversationalist. He was witty, warm, and popular. He had also become very wealthy. His grandfather's death in 1774 left him a substantial inheritance, and a subsequent bequest would make him wealthier still. By the time he enrolled at St. John's College, Cambridge, in October of 1776, at the age of 17, the earnest evangelical boy had been largely replaced. Cambridge in the late 1770s was not, by most accounts, a place that demanded much of its students. Wilberforce would later reflect with genuine regret on the years he spent there, the gambling, the card games, the late evenings spent in the company of friends who had very little interest in intellectual development. He passed his examinations, which required a reasonably good memory and a sharp mind, both of which he possessed. He did not, by his own later admission, make much use of either. What he did acquire was a friendship that would prove enormously consequential. William Pitt the Younger was the son of a former prime minister, already known in political circles, and studying at Cambridge with considerably more seriousness than Wilberforce. They were an unlikely pair, Pitt methodical, intense, and constitutionally inclined toward hard work. Wilberforce gregarious, easily distracted, and gifted with an ease in social settings that Pitt somewhat lacked. They complemented each other. The friendship they formed during those years was genuine, and it lasted. Together in the winter of 1779 and 1780, they began attending parliamentary debates. Wilberforce watched and listened. What he saw was a stage, and he recognized, perhaps instinctively, that he was well suited for it. He was not a physically imposing figure. He would never be. But he had a voice that people remembered, clear, well projected, capable of carrying irony and weight in equal measure. He had a facility for debate, a gift for synthesizing multiple positions and then dismantling the ones he opposed with something that stopped just short of mockery. People found him entertaining. They also found him hard to answer. In 1780, at the age of 21, he stood for election in Hull. He spent the modern equivalent of nearly £2 million on the campaign. He deployed his charm on every group of voters he could reach. He won by a considerable margin. He entered Parliament on the 31st of October, 1780. Pitt followed him there in January 1781. The two young men from Cambridge took their seats in the House of Commons and began what would become, in their different ways, two of the most significant parliamentary careers of the century. Wilberforce's early years in Parliament were characterized by careful observation. He spoke infrequently at first. He joined the clubs, White's, Brooks, where the real business of political alliance building took place. He learned the rhythms of the chamber, how motions were made and blocked, how coalitions formed and dissolved. He also made enemies, which was perhaps inevitable for someone whose sarcasm, in debate, was noted even by his admirers as unusually sharp. He aligned with no party formally. He described himself as an independent, and he meant it, which regularly frustrated both the Tories and the Whigs, who found him useful when his convictions happened to point in their direction and deeply annoying when they did not. In 1784, having established himself sufficiently in the Commons, he attempted something genuinely bold. He ran for one of the Yorkshire seats, one of the most prestigious in Parliament, representing a vast and populous county with significant political weight. It was territory dominated by Charles James Fox's supporters. Wilberforce was not well known there. He entered the contest anyway. He won. The victory was attributed by those who watched it, primarily to his abilities as a speaker. He could hold a crowd. He could make a complicated argument feel simple, and a simple argument feel important. The Yorkshire seat placed him among the most consequential members of the House. He was 25 years old, wealthy, politically powerful, and closely connected to a prime minister. In the autumn of 1784, Wilberforce joined his mother, his sister, and a small group of companions on a tour of the European continent. One member of that party was a man named Isaac Milner, a brilliant mathematician, a scientist of real distinction, and, less commonly known to his traveling companions, a deeply committed evangelical Christian. Wilberforce, who had long since shed the religious sensibility of his Wimbledon childhood, encountered Milner's faith with something between curiosity and condescension. He said so on more than one occasion during the journey. Milner did not react with defensiveness. He engaged, he pushed back. He argued from both intellectual and personal ground, and he did not yield. The journey continued. So did the conversation. On the return trip through Europe in early 1785, the two men read a book together, The Rise and Progress of Religion in the Soul by Philip Doddridge, published 4 decades earlier. Wilberforce found it unexpectedly persuasive. Its arguments were careful. Its reasoning did not ask him to abandon his intellect. It asked him, instead, to consider whether his intellect had been addressing the right questions. He arrived home in England uncertain, in a way he had not been for some years. He threw himself back into parliamentary life, but the uncertainty followed him. Later that year, he and Milner traveled to Europe again and studied the Greek New Testament together throughout the journey. By the time Wilberforce returned to England in the fall of 1785, something had shifted that he could not unshift. He now believed. He was not yet sure what to do with that belief in the context of a career built on parliamentary ambition. The internal conflict was sharp enough that he considered abandoning politics altogether. Pitt was bewildered and argued strenuously against the idea. Neither man was able to persuade the other of anything. Wilberforce remained in a kind of suspended uncertainty. In December of 1785, he sought out the one person whose judgment he trusted more than most, John Newton, the old sailor turned minister whose sermons he had listened to as a child in the Wimbledon household. Newton was 60 years old now. He received his visitor with characteristic calm. The advice Newton offered was direct. A man could be a Christian and a politician. The two were not inherently incompatible. Newton believed, he said, that Wilberforce had been placed in Parliament for purposes that had not yet been revealed. Wilberforce heard this as permission. He also heard it as a challenge. He returned to the Commons, and he began, quietly and methodically, to look for the purpose Newton had described. The mechanism by which William Wilberforce arrived at the cause of abolition was not at its origin dramatic. It came through correspondence. In the fall of 1786, he received a letter from Sir Charles Middleton, a member of Parliament for Rochester, a former naval officer, and an evangelical Christian of similar convictions. Middleton and his wife had been supporting a small network of people who were documenting and speaking publicly against the slave trade, among them James Ramsay, a minister and former sailor who had lived in the Caribbean sugar colonies, and Thomas Clarkson, a young Cambridge scholar who had written a prize essay on slavery and found that he could not stop thinking about it. Middleton's message was essentially a request. The movement had evidence. It had pamphlets. It had the beginnings of public support. What it needed was a voice inside Parliament, someone with the standing, the talent, and the determination to bring the matter formally before the House. Wilberforce did not say yes immediately. He spent the winter of 1786 and 1787 educating himself, meeting with abolitionists, reading their evidence, but also meeting deliberately with men who were deeply invested in the trade. Merchants from the West Indies, members of Parliament whose constituents depended on the revenues the trade generated, Men who spoke of abolition the way they might speak of dismantling the Bank of England. The sugar trade was one of the largest single sources of revenue in the British Empire. The slave trade that supplied its labor force was estimated to transport roughly 100,000 people across the Atlantic each year, primarily from West Africa to the Caribbean and the American mainland. The ships that carried them were built in British ports. The insurance policies that covered them were written in London. The profits that accrued from their labor flowed into British banks, funded British parliamentary elections, and underwrote British cultural life in ways that were nearly impossible to fully trace. The men who ran this system were not marginal figures. They were among the most powerful people in the country. Wilberforce looked at all of this and decided to attack it anyway, before he launched that campaign publicly. However, he addressed himself to another matter. In 1787, Wilberforce began working to reform what he called the manners of English society. He was troubled by a particular kind of hypocrisy he observed in the ruling class. Men who spoke about the moral degeneracy of the poor while conducting their own private lives with considerable license. He believed that meaningful reform of any social ill required, first, a reform of the culture that tolerated it. He noted in his journal around this time that God had set before him two great objects: the suppression of the slave trade and the reformation of manners. He understood these as connected. He would pursue both. In the spring of 1787, in a garden outside London, the specific account places him near an oak tree, with William Pitt and a future prime minister named Grenville. Wilberforce announced that he was ready to act openly against slavery. A few days after Christmas 1787, he gave notice to the House of Commons that during the following session he would move to abolish the slave trade. He believed the matter would be resolved quickly. He was, as he would discover over the next 2 decades, entirely wrong. The year 1788 began badly. In the weeks before Wilberforce was scheduled to bring his motion to the floor, he fell seriously ill. The nature of the illness is not precisely recorded, but it was severe enough that those around him feared for his life. He could not appear in Parliament. Pitt stepped in, managing the matter temporarily on his friend's behalf, calling for the House to investigate the trade, presenting the question in carefully neutral terms, ensuring it did not disappear from the agenda while Wilberforce recovered. The illness would prove to be a pattern. Throughout the campaign against the slave trade, Wilberforce's health would repeatedly fail at critical moments, not dramatically, not in ways that make for clean narrative, but chronically, consistently, in the manner of a body that has been overtaxed for years without adequate rest. He was prescribed dry opium pills by his physician, a common treatment at the time for a range of conditions. He would take them for the rest of his life. He was aware of their effects. He noted in later years an increase in forgetfulness that he attributed partly to his age and partly to the medicine. He used them anyway. Without them, he wrote, he could not function at all. He returned to Parliament in November 1788 and commenced the formal preparation for his first major speech against the trade. On the 5th of May 1789, William Wilberforce rose in the House of Commons and spoke for 3.5 hours. He did not shout. He did not appeal to emotion in ways that might alienate the men he needed to persuade. He spoke to their sense of reason, their understanding of evidence, and their obligations as members of a governing institution. He presented data gathered by Thomas Clarkson, information about mortality rates during the crossing, about the conditions in which enslaved people were transported, about the economic arguments that had been made in defense of the trade, and why those arguments did not hold under examination. Several powerful men supported him. Edmund Burke expressed his approval. Wilberforce believed, when he sat down, that momentum was building. On a June 3 through 1789, the House of Commons declined to vote on his proposal, declaring that the evidence was insufficient. He returned in 1790 with more evidence. He returned in 1791 with arguments shaped by months of additional research. He produced, over the course of these years, tens of thousands of pages of documentation, folio pages that were tragically destroyed in a fire in 1834 and exist now only in summaries and references. In April of 1791, a vote was held. He lost by 75 votes. By the end of that year, a slave uprising on the French-controlled island of Saint-Domingue had given his opponents a new weapon. Rumors circulated that the enslaved people had risen because of Wilberforce's parliamentary campaign. Wilberforce denied the connection. It did not matter. The argument had been made, and it found an audience. In 1792, a partial victory arrived. Parliament voted to gradually ban the slave trade, with a proposed end date of 1796. Wilberforce considered this inadequate, but accepted it as progress. The House of Lords then demanded fresh evidence before acting on the measure, effectively stalling it indefinitely. In 1793, war with France began. The political atmosphere shifted. Abolitionists were labeled radicals. Wilberforce's cause was associated, by those who opposed it, with the dangerous ideas flowing across the Channel from revolutionary Paris. The argument was not serious. The abolition movement had nothing in common with Jacobin politics, but it did not need to be serious. It needed only to generate anxiety in enough members of Parliament to prevent a vote. His bill to restrict the slave trade passed the House in 1793 and died in the Lords. In 1796, he came closer than he had ever come. The bill was on its third reading. He had done the counting. He believed he had the numbers. That evening, several of his closest supporters in Parliament chose instead to attend a new Italian opera. His opponents stayed in the chamber. When the vote was taken, the bill failed by 4 votes. Wilberforce did not record his feelings about this in detail. His friends described him as devastated. His health declined again. Isaac Milner came to London to help care for him. He did not quit. He reorganized, recovered, and returned. There is a question that runs underneath the entire account of Wilberforce's parliamentary career, and it is not a comfortable one. Defeat after defeat, year after year, with no guarantee that success would ever come. What keeps a person going? In Wilberforce's case, the answer is probably several things at once, and not all of them are equally admirable. His religious conviction was genuine and deep. The faith he had arrived at through those long conversations with Isaac Milner was not a performance for public consumption. His private papers, his journals, his letters to close friends are full of theological reflection, self-examination, and a kind of ongoing argument with himself about whether he was living up to the demands of the beliefs he held. He was also, it must be said, a man who found Parliament genuinely enjoyable. Not the cause, the institution. He liked the chamber, the argument, the social texture of political life. Even in his most difficult years, he was present and engaged. He played cards. He attended dinners. He maintained friendships across party lines with a fluency that suggested he was, at some level, simply well-suited to the environment. The cause gave him purpose. The institution gave him pleasure. Both kept him returning. And then, in 1797, something else arrived. Her name was Barbara Spooner. She was the third of 10 children of a Birmingham banker, 20 years old to his 38, and she was, by his account, the person who made the second half of his life navigable. He proposed within 2 weeks of meeting her. They were married on the 30th of May, 1797, at the parish church of Walcott in Bath. The match was considered by some of his friends and colleagues as hasty, and possibly beneath him socially. Wilberforce did not appear to care. He was, as he freely acknowledged, completely in love. They would have 6 children in 10 years. Barbara became, as one contemporary put it, an anchor, a fixed point in the shifting landscape of alliance, defeat, and recovery that constituted his professional life. She was protective of his time and attention in ways that occasionally frustrated his political allies. She was devoted to him in ways that he found steadying at every point at which the campaign threatened to break him. The years between 1797 and 1806 were, for Wilberforce and the abolition movement, a period of grinding, patient work without clear progress. His friend William Pitt was now fully consumed by the demands of governing a country at war with Napoleonic France. Pitt had always been a supporter of abolition in principle. He had said so publicly and sincerely, but principle and political capacity are not the same thing. Pitt repeatedly promised Wilberforce that he would act more decisively on the matter once the situation with France was stabilized. The situation with France was never stabilized. When Pitt resigned in 1801, Wilberforce was left working with Henry Addington, the new prime minister, who had still less enthusiasm for the cause. During these same years, he took positions that were deeply unpopular with people who might otherwise have supported his abolitionist campaign. He backed legislation restricting public assembly. He supported the Corn Laws. He argued that these positions were consistent with his belief in gradual constitutional reform rather than radical disruption. His opponents argued that a man who claimed to care about human freedom was being inconsistent. The argument was not without force, and it followed him for the rest of his public life. He was also, in 1796, 4 votes from victory because of an opera. He was not without resources. He had allies of genuine ability. He had public opinion shifting, slowly and measurably, in his direction. Then William Pitt died. Pitt's death on the 23rd of January, 1806, was unexpected in its timing and devastating to those who had been close to him. Wilberforce had loved his friend. He had also at moments been profoundly frustrated by him. The complexity of that relationship, the warmth, the loyalty, the genuine political partnership, and the years of deferred promises was not easily resolved. But what Pitt's death produced almost immediately was a change in the character of the government. The new ministry included men who were not merely supportive of abolition in principle, they were actively committed to it. Lord Grenville, Charles James Fox. Others in the cabinet shared their views. James Stephen's legal strategy now came into its own. Rather than attacking the slave trade directly, Stephen proposed a bill that would prevent British ships from supplying enslaved people to colonies belonging to foreign powers. In a time of war, supporting the French colonial economy was politically untenable. The bill was framed as a war measure. It passed with minimal opposition. It significantly reduced the profitability of the British slave trade almost immediately. The abolitionists recognized that the moment had come. On June 10, 1806, Charles Fox delivered a speech in the House of Commons proposing a resolution that the slave trade be brought to a final close. It passed by more than 100 votes. Fox died that September. Grenville continued. In January of 1807, Grenville pushed the full abolition bill through the House of Lords with what observers described as unusual speed and determination, taking advantage of the fractured state of the opposition. The bill came to the House of Commons in February of 1807. On the 24th of February, at 4 in the morning, by a vote of 283 to 16, it passed. On the 25th of March, 1807, the bill for the abolition of the slave trade received royal assent and became law. The trade, the buying and selling of human beings by British subjects and on British ships, was now illegal. The passage of the Abolition Act did not end the institution of slavery in the British Empire. It ended the legal trade in enslaved people, which was significant, but incomplete. Hundreds of thousands of people remained enslaved on British colonial plantations. They would not be freed by the 1807 Act. That remained the next battle. Wilberforce understood this from the beginning. He had argued, throughout the campaign, that ending the trade was the first step, that by cutting off the supply of new enslaved people, the economics of plantation slavery would be forced to change. Whether this reasoning fully held was questionable, and he knew it. The ultimate goal was complete emancipation. What followed in the years after 1807 was a sustained British effort, political, diplomatic, and naval, to extend the abolition beyond British waters and to pressure other nations to follow suit. It was not a clean process. It was contested at home and abroad. Some members of Parliament opposed the expenditure of naval resources on enforcement. Some merchants with investments in American cotton or Cuban sugar found ways to remain indifferent to the cause. The effort was real, but it was neither universal nor free of contradiction. Wilberforce participated in all of it. He corresponded with abolitionists in Europe and America. He supported the Africa Institution. He pushed for a registry bill. By the early 1820s, he had begun looking for successors. He found them. A group of younger members of Parliament, men who had grown up with abolition as an established moral position rather than a dangerous radical idea, were willing to take on the next campaign. Wilberforce began the process of formally handing over the parliamentary leadership of the movement while maintaining his own role as a public figure whose moral authority on the subject remained considerable. In 1823, the Society for the Mitigation and Gradual Abolition of Slavery throughout the British dominions was established. Wilberforce was among its founders. The last decade of Wilberforce's life was quieter, in some ways, than anything that had preceded it. He spent more time in the countryside, with Barbara and their children. He pursued his religious interests with deepening intensity. He built a church in 1829 for the people who worked his estate, an act that summarizes something essential about how he understood the relationship between faith and practical obligation. He was not without grief. A daughter's romance with a West Indian slaveholder produced months of anxiety, though it eventually came to nothing. His eldest son's struggles continued to worry him. His own body, ravaged by decades of illness, made daily life increasingly difficult. In 1833, the news he had been waiting for arrived. Parliamentary sentiment had shifted significantly. Large slave uprisings in Jamaica and other British colonies in the late 1820s and early 1830s had demonstrated, with considerable force, the instability of the system. The Reform Act of 1832 had brought new members into Parliament with different political assumptions. A bill for the general emancipation of enslaved people throughout the British Empire was moving through Parliament. Wilberforce traveled to London in early July 1833 to hear the third and final reading. He was 73 years old. He had been ill for months. He came anyway. On the 25th of July, 1833, the Slavery Abolition Act passed. Wilberforce was reported to have said, in the hours after the passage of the bill, that he thanked God that he had lived to witness a day on which England was willing to give £20 million for the abolition of slavery. The £20 million was the sum Parliament had allocated to compensate the owners of enslaved people, a provision that has, in subsequent generations, been the subject of considerable moral scrutiny. Wilberforce, in that moment, did not focus on the complication. He focused on the result. 4 days later, on the 29th of July, 1833, William Wilberforce died. He was 73 years old. Parliament requested that he be buried in Westminster Abbey. He was interred there on August 3, 1833, in the north transept, near the grave of his friend William Pitt. The Slavery Abolition Act of 1833 did not take full effect immediately. Its provisions included a transition period, a system of apprenticeship for formerly enslaved people that functioned, in practice, as a continuation of forced labor under a different name. Wilberforce had written to his allies shortly before his death, urging them to remove those provisions. He was not successful. The apprenticeship system lasted until 1838, when it was abolished under pressure from the same networks of abolitionists he had helped build. In the decades after his death, Britain deployed significant resources, political, diplomatic, and naval, to suppress the slave trade globally. Between 1807 and 1860, the West African Squadron of the Royal Navy intercepted approximately 1,600 slave vessels and freed roughly 150,000 people. The cost was measured in lives as well as treasure. Approximately 2,000 British sailors and Marines died in this campaign. Other squadrons operated in South America, the Indian Ocean, and East Asia. This was not a clean record. The same British Empire that deployed those warships was simultaneously engaged in colonial projects that produced their own forms of coercion. The contradictions were real and substantial. His biographers have argued about what motivated him. A historian named Eric Williams proposed in the 1940s that economic factors, rather than moral conviction, were the primary driver of British abolitionism, that the slave trade was abolished because it had become less profitable, not because enough people had genuinely changed their minds about its ethics. The consensus among historians since has moved away from the pure economic thesis, without eliminating it entirely. The picture that has emerged is more complicated. Economic pressures, moral conviction, political calculation, religious networks, and the long work of documentation and testimony all played roles that are difficult to rank in simple hierarchy. Thomas Clarkson, who had spent decades gathering evidence and organizing support, lived until 1846 and watched, with some bitterness, as the popular memory of abolitionism narrowed to focus primarily on the man who had been its parliamentary face. Grenville, Fox, Stephen, Macaulay, the Middletons, all of them receded. This is a common problem with the way history is told. The single figure who can be named and portrayed becomes the story. The networks, the collaboration, the decades of unremarkable work by people whose names do not appear in any biography, these disappear. Wilberforce understood this dynamic, at least in part. He was also, without question, the reason the cause had a face in Parliament at a time when it needed one. There is a line in one of Wilberforce's letters, written late in his life, that has stayed with people who have read his correspondence carefully. He is writing about the decades of the campaign, the failures, the disappointments, the moments when the cause seemed definitively lost. And he describes himself as having been sustained by a conviction that he was not the author of the outcome, that the outcome was not, finally, his responsibility. He meant this theologically. He believed that whether the trade was abolished or not, His obligation was to act according to his conscience and leave the rest to something beyond his control. This is a belief that could become a kind of passivity. In Wilberforce's case, it seems to have functioned differently. It freed him from the paralysis that often attends the pursuit of very large goals that are not immediately achievable. He could lose the vote in April and come back in November. He could watch the bill die in the Lords for the 4th time and begin drafting the arguments for the 5th. He did not need the outcome to happen now. He needed to continue working. Whether this represents wisdom or a certain insulation from the full weight of what he was describing, the actual people whose lives and deaths were at stake in each postponed vote is a question worth sitting with. He was a man of his time in ways that are apparent. He was also, within those constraints, a person who spent the majority of his adult life trying to do something about a practice that most of the people around him preferred to leave alone. The oak tree in the garden. The 4 in the morning vote. The letter to Pitt written from a sickbed in 1788, asking his friend to carry the cause for a while. The quiet death in a rented house in London 4 days after the bill finally passed. These are the facts. They do not resolve into a clean judgment. They sit there as they have sat for nearly 2 centuries, requiring something from whoever encounters them, not necessarily admiration and not condemnation, but the sustained and uncomfortable work of trying to understand what it actually looks like when a person tries, across a whole lifetime, to change something that seems almost too large to change.